On a quiet morning in Providence, Rhode Island, Judge Frank Caprio took his seat in the municipal courtroom where he'd presided for decades. The docket that day looked routine: parking violations, minor infractions, the ordinary business of a city court. But standing in line among the younger defendants was a man who would capture the heart of everyone in that room. Nicholas Manzo, 93 years old, waited his turn with the patience of someone who had lived through history itself. Nicholas Manzo had been driving since 1945. 72 years behind the wheel without a single ticket, without a single violation. He'd navigated the streets of Providence through 8 decades of changing traffic laws, evolving car technology, and generations of drivers. Now, in his 10th decade of life, he stood before a judge for the first time. The citation seemed small, a minor traffic infraction, but for a man with an unblemished record spanning nearly 3/4 of a century, it represented something more than a simple mistake. Frank Caprio had built a reputation over his years on the bench. Unlike many judges who moved through dockets with mechanical efficiency, Caprio believed every person who stood before him deserved to be heard. His courtroom had become known as a place where justice wore a human face, where circumstances mattered as much as citations. When Nicholas Manzo approached the bench, Caprio didn't see a case number. He saw a man whose life had spanned from the Great Depression to the digital age, and he leaned forward to listen. As Nicholas stood before the bench, Judge Caprio noticed something on the paperwork that made him pause. Nicholas Manzo was a World War II veteran. He'd served in the Pacific Theater, where American forces had fought through some of the bloodiest battles in military history. Islands with names like Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa had become synonymous with sacrifice. Young men like Nicholas had crossed an ocean to fight an enemy determined to never surrender, enduring heat, disease, and combat that would mark them forever. The Pacific Campaign had tested every man who served there. Unlike the European theater, where surrender sometimes came swiftly, the Pacific battles were characterized by fierce resistance and brutal conditions. Nicholas and his fellow soldiers had faced an enemy who fought from hidden bunkers and trenches, who chose death over capture. They waded through jungles thick with disease-carrying insects, endured tropical storms, and watched friends fall on beaches thousands of miles from home. Those who returned came back changed, carrying memories they rarely discussed. Judge Caprio looked at the elderly veteran standing before him and asked about his service. Nicholas's voice, still steady despite his years, carried across the courtroom as he spoke about the Pacific. He didn't elaborate on the horrors or dramatize his role. Men of his generation rarely did. They'd been raised to shoulder their burdens quietly, to do their duty without seeking recognition. But in that moment, with the judge asking and the courtroom listening, Nicholas confirmed what the record showed: he had been there, in the Pacific, when the world hung in the balance. As Judge Caprio listened to Nicholas's story, the traffic violation began to shrink in significance. Here was a man who had given years of his youth to military service, who had returned home to build a life in Providence, who had driven responsibly for 7 decades. The judge understood something fundamental: justice isn't just about enforcing rules mechanically. It's about seeing the whole person, understanding the arc of their life, recognizing that a single mistake doesn't define 72 years of responsibility. The courtroom had gone quiet, everyone waiting to see how Caprio would respond. What Judge Caprio was seeing was more than just a veteran. Nicholas Manzo represented an entire generation that had come home from war and built modern America. They'd returned from battlefields to raise families, work jobs, pay taxes, and contribute to their communities without fanfare. They didn't demand special treatment or constant recognition. They simply lived their lives with the same discipline and responsibility they'd learned in service. Nicholas's 72 years of clean driving wasn't just about following traffic laws, it reflected a lifetime of doing things the right way. At 93, driving had become more challenging for Nicholas. Reflexes that had once been sharp had slowed. Vision that had spotted enemy positions across Pacific Islands now struggled with modern traffic patterns. The very act of appearing in court, navigating the building, standing before the judge, explaining himself, required effort that younger defendants couldn't comprehend. Yet here he stood, accepting responsibility, showing the same accountability he demonstrated throughout his life. Judge Caprio could see the dignity in that posture, the quiet strength of a man who refused to make excuses. Judge Caprio had heard enough. He looked at Nicholas Manzo, war veteran, responsible citizen, a man with 7 decades of perfect driving, and made his decision. The traffic ticket would be dismissed. Not because the violation hadn't occurred, but because justice sometimes means recognizing that punishment isn't always appropriate. The judge spoke directly to Nicholas, thanking him for his service, acknowledging his remarkable driving record, and expressing gratitude for men like him who had sacrificed so much. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, a rare sound in any municipal court. What happened in that Providence courtroom wasn't about ignoring the law. It was about applying it with wisdom and humanity. Judge Caprio had the authority to enforce the citation, to collect the fine, to add 1 mark to Nicholas's previously perfect record. He also had the authority to look at the totality of circumstances, a man's age, his service, his lifetime of responsibility, and choose mercy. The law gives judges discretion precisely for moments like this, when strict enforcement would serve no purpose beyond mechanical adherence to procedure. Caprio used that discretion as it was intended. The case of Nicholas Manzo resonated far beyond that Providence courtroom. When footage of the hearing spread online, millions of people watched and shared it, moved by what they saw. In an era when many Americans feel processed rather than heard by institutions, Judge Caprio's treatment of Nicholas offered something different. It showed that bureaucracy doesn't have to be cold, that authority figures can exercise power with compassion, that systems can still make room for human dignity. People weren't just watching a ticket get dismissed, they were witnessing the kind of justice they wished existed everywhere. Nicholas Manzo's reaction was characteristically modest. He thanked Judge Caprio, shook his hand, and left the courtroom the same way he'd entered, with quiet dignity. He didn't seek media attention or try to leverage the moment into 15 minutes of fame. Men of his generation simply didn't operate that way. He'd come to court to face a consequence, been shown unexpected mercy, and accepted it with the same grace he'd shown throughout the proceeding. In his mind, this was probably just another day, another kindness encountered in a long life full of both hardship and humanity. For Judge Frank Caprio, the Nicholas Manzo case exemplified everything he believed about justice. Caprio had long maintained that a judge's role wasn't simply to apply rules but to understand people. His courtroom philosophy held that most people appearing before him weren't criminals, they were ordinary citizens who'd made mistakes, faced hardship, or encountered circumstances beyond their control. By listening to their stories and considering their situations, he could make decisions that served justice rather than just processing paperwork. The law, in Caprio's hands, became an instrument of fairness rather than mere enforcement. Nicholas Manzo's appearance in court served as a reminder of a generation that was rapidly disappearing. Every day, hundreds of World War II veterans pass away, taking with them first-hand memories of events that shaped the modern world. They survived the Great Depression, fought in history's largest war, built the post-war economy, and raised the baby boom generation. They did all this while rarely complaining or demanding recognition for their sacrifices. Judge Caprio's treatment of Nicholas honored not just one man, but an entire generation whose contributions had built the world we inherited. Time was running out to thank them. The Nicholas Manzo case became one of the most viewed episodes of Caught in Providence, the television show that documented Judge Caprio's courtroom. The program had been filming Caprio's proceedings for years, capturing countless moments of judicial compassion and common-sense justice. But the episode featuring the 93-year-old veteran struck a particular chord. Viewers saw in those few minutes everything that made Caprio's approach special: his respect for people's dignity, his recognition of context, his willingness to see defendants as fellow human beings rather than case numbers. It was justice as it should be practiced. What Judge Frank Caprio did for Nicholas Manzo cost nothing and changed everything. A dismissed ticket meant no fine for a veteran on a fixed income, no blemish on a spotless 72-year driving record, no bureaucratic punishment for a momentary lapse by a 93-year-old man. But it meant something more. It demonstrated that institutions could still value people over procedures, that authority figures could exercise power with heart, that an aging veteran who'd sacrificed for his country decades earlier could still receive recognition and gratitude. In that Providence courtroom, on an ordinary morning, justice was served with the compassion it deserved. The story of Nicholas Manzo and Judge Frank Caprio reminds us that justice and mercy aren't opposites, they're partners. Every day, courts across America process thousands of cases, many handled with efficiency but without empathy. What made this case different wasn't that the law was ignored, but that it was applied with wisdom and humanity. Judge Caprio saw past the violation to see the violator, a decorated veteran, a responsible citizen, a man in the winter of his life who deserved better than mechanical punishment. He chose understanding over indifference, and in doing so, he showed us what justice can be when those who wield it remember that defendants are people first.